having such terrible thoughts. You'd say that it won't happen, but you said you'd help and you haven't. I've been cutting everyone off, get a head start on my run. I won't be your sheep, your coin, or your son. These are just in the spread of cats, coherent yet unknown names. Oh, can you put me in codes? 'Cause I was born for this language game. To fall on one side means that I lie. On the other, I would die. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify.
Well, hello, everyone. And at this point, no one on this live stream. This was a bit of a last minute thing for me to do. I just decided to jump on here to see if anyone would want to kind of hear the sermon that I'm going to be preaching on Sunday. Maybe give some feedback, some responses. So I'm going to wait a little bit. I know I said I would start at 6:15. We're not quite there yet, so I'm going to wait around a little bit for people to show up. And we'll see if we can get some people on the live chat or people listening to this. Thought it would be interesting to give you a little bit of insight into how I'm preparing for sermons. And at this point, I have a fairly rough draft of one. And what I usually do is by myself, talking to nobody, I will read through my manuscript, and then in the light of that, kind of identify certain sentences or words or anything like that that seems a little bit funky and doesn't read that well, and kind of go back through and edit in that way. And I'm trying to keep this within about 15 minutes in length. I don't like to preach very long sermons. I try to keep things pretty tight and concise. So that's what I'm looking for when I'm doing this. And yeah, so I'm going to give it a few more minutes and see if people jump on. But I'm going to turn off my cam. Let's see if we can get some more people. Ethan, how's it going? I'm going to go ahead and get started. But like I was saying, this, you can probably hear my cat meowing in the background. I wanted to practice this not by myself, which is what I usually do, and kind of give people insight into things that I do, not on the channel, which is preparing for sermons. And what I do is I read through the manuscript by myself usually, or to Laura when she's here. And I'll kind of read through and see what sentences or phrases or words are kind of funky, and then go back and edit in that way. So yeah, if y'all could leave any comments or suggestions or feedback or whatever, that would be great. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've got the lectionary text from the Gospel of Mark for Sunday, which is Mark 4, verses 35 to 41. So I'll go ahead and start by reading that, getting into preacher mode. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them on the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and the sea. "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Before I launch into the sermon, I'm going to shut the door because my cat is being obnoxious. So one moment. Okay. This scene of Jesus stilling the storm on the Sea of Galilee is probably one of the most familiar stories in the Gospels. Many of you may remember the event in children's story Bibles or pictures on the walls of Sunday school classrooms. Jesus standing on the edge of the boat with his arms outstretched over the white caps of a raging sea. And with this sort of imagery in mind, our text for this morning is most often interpreted principally as a miracle story, demonstrating the incredible power of Jesus to overcome a natural event on behalf of his friends. While there's, of course, a basic truth to this, the story provides us with so much more than a simple affirmation that Jesus can do anything. The events recorded in this section of Mark's Gospel take place on alternate sides of the Sea of Galilee. Since the most direct route between the shores was across the sea itself, there are several references to boat crossings in Mark in chapters 4 and 5. Scholars have noted, however, that Jesus' command to his disciples in 4:35, "Let us go across to the other side," indicates more than simply a change of scenery. The other side represents Gentile territory, the country of the Gerasenes that's referenced in 5:1. This is Jesus' first foray in Mark to what may have been considered as a dangerous and even potentially inappropriate territory. So Jesus' venture into a foreign region across the sea is a deliberate gesture toward the idea that his mission extends beyond the Jewish people per se. And by extending his mission into Gentile territory geographically, Jesus is reaching out to even the enemies of the house of Israel. On the way to the other side, the boat encounters a great windstorm, which was not an unusual occurrence on the often tempestuous Sea of Galilee. The disciples surely knew this very well, given their previous professions of being on the water. I'm not sure who has seen the show Deadliest Catch on the Discovery Channel, which chronicles the real-life high-sea adventures of Alaskan crab fishermen. But while the Alaskan waters are certainly more violent and cold and dangerous than the Sea of Galilee, what seems to be common among those in fishing professions is that encountering dangerous waters becomes a regular occurrence for them. They're surely accustomed to the mercurial nature of the water and have a certain level of respect for its unpredictability. But this doesn't mean that the body's natural response of fear in the face of real danger ever ceases. The author of Mark goes out of their way to emphasize that this was the Greek megas, a great windstorm, which he repeats more times in the passage with respect to calm, a great calm in verse 39, and fear, a great fear in verse 41. As New Testament scholar Joel Marcus notes, quote, the repetition of megas, or great, implies that the disciples are threatened by a devastating superhuman power, end quote. So we're not just dealing here with waves and water in Mark's narrative. It's not just dealing with bad weather for fishermen. We're dealing with evil, a powerful apocalyptic force that the author dramatizes using the imagery of the chaos of the sea. The waves appear to be symbolic of the hostility not just to the disciples in the narrative, but to Jesus' mission being experienced by the original hearers of the gospel that the author attributes to demonic hostility back in the first chapter of Mark. The disciples in their little boat, like Mark's community, are being crushed from all sides by the violent attempts at destruction by anti-God powers. And to the disciples' dismay, Jesus is snoozing peacefully in the stern of the boat. And this situation is even more terrifying when we recall that there were other boats at sea with them, mentioned at the end of verse 36, which are never mentioned again. The gospel reveals a deafening silence concerning their journey across the sea. What happened to them while Jesus was asleep? Were they screaming for help? Were they overtaken by the sea? Were they taking their last gasps of air as Jesus slept? Did Jesus care about them? Jesus' friends on the boat asked the same questions. Do you not care that we're dying? In waking up and seeing the storm, Jesus issues a command to the wind and the sea. Jesus' words are reminiscent of the command issued to the unclean spirit in 125, where, like here, demonic power is being cast out and told to be silent in rather rude terms. And normally our Bibles say something like, peace, be still, in this text, right? When a more accurate reading would be something like, silence, shut up. But the passage also reveals to Mark's listeners that the hostility they may be experiencing is ultimately unavailing. It's not just our passage's description of the terror experienced by the little group of tempest-tossed disciples that corresponds to the experience of Mark's community, but also its portrayal of the effect of Jesus' word. Quote, and the wind died down, and there was a great calm. Jesus has, in this story, conquered the external threat, but turns now to an internal one, asking his companions why they are so afraid, and whether they do not yet really trust him. But while our passage indicates that Jesus' power can overcome the forces of death that threaten to overtake his people, this victory has in Mark a curiously provisional character. Jesus exercises the roaring power of the sea here, but in the very next passage, the evil power will reappear on dry land in the form of a screaming demoniac, only to be driven back into the sea in a sprinting herd of possessed pigs. And by the time Jesus again crosses the sea in chapter 6, the waters have reverted to its possessed state and will need to be subdued by a renewed epiphany of Jesus. In Mark's narrative, Jesus has not yet unleashed the final death blow against death, the culminating event where his story is rapidly heading to his death on a Roman cross. And we know the provisional character of Mark's story all too well, because bad things have happened do happen and will continue to happen. It's important to note that Jesus never says there is nothing to be afraid of. This just isn't in the text. Jesus is not expecting his followers to rid themselves of all fear. The Galilean storm was doubtless fearsome, as are the winds and waves in our lives that threaten us. There are very real things that we are justified in being afraid of. Isolation, loneliness, betrayal, pain, rejection, illness, meaninglessness, financial ruin, or death. Being a victim of gun violence, or of a hate crime. And I know for me during this time, there's a fear of transitioning to a new state, a new city, a new home, and leaving a place that I've known for 9 years is very real, as well as the fear of not being able to find consistent work. And there's, of course, the more general fear that maybe we really are alone in this world. And that, in the words of the band As Cities Burn, quote, "If there's a God, then he must be asleep. God must be asleep." Maybe we feel less like the disciples and more like the nameless people on their boats without Jesus aboard, who seem to disappear from the story altogether. What Jesus is saying to his disciples, though, and what he says to us, is not some empty attempt to comfort, like there is nothing to be afraid of. After all, Jesus would simply not be telling the truth if he did. When I was a child, I was terrified for a period that there was a ghost in my closet. If my parents had tried to comfort me by saying, "There's just nothing to be scared of," I would have probably said, "Hell yeah, there are definitely things to be scared of." And instead, in the story, Jesus is asking us to consider and reflect on, why are you afraid? Why are we afraid? Trusting in Jesus does not mean that bad things will never happen. They will. Trusting in Jesus doesn't mean that we won't doubt God's presence with us. We will. But this doesn't change the fact that God is here. Trusting God in the midst of the storm means grasping onto, with everything we've got, the reality that fear and death and the principalities and powers of darkness that threaten us do not and will never have the final word. The final word of all words, the truth of all truths, is that God is with us. The final word and final hope is Jesus Christ. And this is not a cheap fix that says your suffering or fear don't matter, because everything's going to work out in the end. I do wish it was that easy. But it does mean that because God is with us now, in the midst of everything we face, we can be confident in crying out to Jesus like the disciples did, even when we feel like we're on a different boat altogether. Don't you care that we're about to die? Don't you care that I'm in pain, that I'm hurting, that I feel lost, that I'm scared and feel alone? Won't you still this storm? My God, why have you forsaken me? God's response may not be what we want to hear. God's response may not be instant comfort or assurance or an immediate solution. God's response is not an easy answer about how, if you wait, everything is going to be okay in the future. God's response is, what you're going through matters to me, because you're my child. I made you, and I'm making you new. I love you so much that I've entered into all of your pain and fear and suffering, even to death on the cross. Don't be afraid. I'm with you. My parents, in the rather trivial story I mentioned earlier, didn't comfort me by saying there's nothing to worry about, but by saying, you don't need to be scared, John. We're here. We're with you. I am with you. The deepest truth about reality is that God, the God who raised Jesus from the dead, reveals that while there are very real and fearsome things in this life, they do not paralyze us. They do not have dominion over us. And they don't own us. We're not alone on this boat. May it be so. Amen. All right, so that's a run through of this short little sermon that I'll be preaching on Sunday on Mark 4, verses 35 to 41. That was around 15 minutes. 14 to 15 minutes, which is, I don't know if people have any comments or questions or whatever. But yeah, thanks for the few people who watched this. I'm going to leave it up on the channel at least for a little bit, and see if it gets some watches, because maybe it's something that somebody needs to hear. And with that, I'm going to do some outro music. This has been a Weird Apocalypse Here episode. Thanks everyone for watching.
Having such terrible thoughts.